Spain found more treasure than any nation in history. Mountains of silver, oceans of gold, enough wealth to buy every kingdom in Europe. They went bankrupt 9 times. How does the richest country on earth run out of money? How does unlimited treasure destroy an empire? In 1545, a shepherd made a campfire in the Bolivian Andes, 16,000 feet up, freezing cold. When the flames died down, he saw something glinting in the ashes, molten silver pouring out of the ground beneath his fire. He had just discovered Cerro Rico, the rich mountain, the largest silver deposit ever found on Earth. The indigenous people had another name for it. They called it the mountain that eats men. Within 50 years, the mining town below would become larger than London, larger than Paris. So wealthy, the Spanish invented a new word for unimaginable riches, worth a Potosi. That mountain would kill 8 million people, and it would kill the Spanish Empire, too. This is the story of how unlimited silver became a curse, how the greatest treasure in history destroyed the nation that found it, and why too much money can be worse than too little. In the early 1500s, Spain was already powerful. Ferdinand and Isabella had united the kingdoms. Columbus had sailed west. The conquistadors were carving out an empire in the Americas. But the real windfall hadn't arrived yet. Then came Cortez and the Aztec gold, Pizarro and the Inca silver, and finally, in 1545, Cerro Rico. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain extracted an estimated 45,000 tons of pure silver from Potosi alone. That's 90 million pounds, enough to build a bridge of silver from Spain to the Americas. At its peak, Cerro Rico produced 60% of all the silver in the world. Every year, treasure fleets sailed from the Americas carrying wealth that dwarfed the entire annual budgets of European kingdoms. The Spanish called it a gift from God, a reward for spreading the faith, a sign that their empire was blessed. They had no idea what was coming. The first problem was inflation. When money suddenly floods into an economy faster than goods can be produced, prices rise. It's simple mathematics. More money chasing the same amount of stuff means each piece of money is worth less. Spain discovered this the hard way. In 1500, before the treasure ships really started flowing, prices in Spain were stable. By 1600, they had quadrupled. In some regions, they increased 6-fold. A loaf of bread that cost 1 coin now cost 4. A day's wages bought a quarter of what it used to buy. Real incomes collapsed even as silver poured into the country. Workers grew poorer while treasure ships grew fuller. The paradox was maddening. How could everyone get poorer when so much money was coming in? The Spanish scholar Martín de Azpilicueta noticed what was happening as early as 1556. He wrote that the influx of precious metals was destroying the value of money itself. He had discovered the quantity theory of money centuries before modern economists gave it a name. But nobody listened. The kings were too busy spending. The bankers were too busy lending. The merchants were too busy importing. The silver kept coming, and the prices kept rising. The second problem was even worse. Economists today call it Dutch disease. Here's how it works. When a country suddenly gets rich from one resource, that resource crowds out everything else. Why would anyone invest in factories when there's silver to be dug? Why would anyone build textile mills when treasure ships are more profitable? Before the silver rush, Spain had thriving industries. The wool trade was famous across Europe. Spanish textiles were exported throughout the Mediterranean. Spanish iron and Spanish ships were in demand everywhere. After the silver rush, those industries collapsed. The port of Santander had once exported 17,000 sacks of wool per year. By the early 1600s, it exported almost nothing. Spanish manufacturers couldn't compete. The inflation made Spanish goods too expensive compared to foreign products. It was cheaper to import textiles from England and the Netherlands than to make them at home. So Spain imported everything. The silver that flowed in flowed right back out to pay for goods that Spain used to make for itself. The empire became rich in money but poor in production. A hollow shell filled with treasure. The third problem was debt. You'd think the richest country in the world wouldn't need to borrow money. You'd be wrong. The Spanish monarchs had expensive tastes and expensive wars everywhere all the time. Charles V fought the Protestant Reformation across Europe. He battled the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. He maintained armies in Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands. He was Holy Roman Emperor, which meant he had to defend half of Europe against the other half. His son Philip II was even worse. The Dutch revolt alone lasted 80 years and consumed fortunes. The Spanish Armada cost 10 million ducats. The Great Palace of El Escorial cost another 5.5 million. War against England, war against France, war against the Ottomans, war against the Dutch, war against Protestant princes. Wars on 3 continents at once. The treasure ships couldn't keep up. Despite all that silver, royal expenditures consistently outpaced royal income. So the kings borrowed. They borrowed from the Fugger family in Germany, the greatest bankers of the age. They borrowed from Genoese financiers who charged ruinous interest. They borrowed against future silver shipments, spending the treasure before it arrived. And then the treasure ships would sink, or pirates would capture them, or hurricanes would scatter them across the Atlantic. The Caribbean was a graveyard of Spanish silver. When the expected silver didn't arrive, the kings couldn't pay their debts. Philip II declared bankruptcy in 1557, just 1 year after taking the throne. He declared bankruptcy again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596. 4 bankruptcies in 40 years. And the silver was still flowing. How does the richest country in the world go bankrupt 4 times? Because the silver wasn't making Spain stronger. It was making Spain weaker. Every ducat spent on wars was a ducat not invested in industry. Every bankruptcy destroyed the confidence of lenders and merchants. Every round of inflation transferred wealth from productive workers to those who happened to hold treasure. The Spanish nobility grew contemptuous of commerce. Why work when you could live off silver? Why invest when the king would just take your money for another war? Contemporary observers noted that Spaniards seemed to prefer begging to working. The flood of easy money had destroyed the incentive to produce. Meanwhile, the countries Spain was fighting were getting stronger. The Dutch, rebelling against Spanish rule, were building factories and shipping companies. The English were developing their woolen industry. The French were centralizing their economy. These nations didn't have silver mines, so they had to actually make things. And in the long run, making things matters more than digging up metal. The true cost of Spain's silver cannot be measured in ducats. Cerro Rico was known by another name among the indigenous people. They called it the mountain that eats men. The Spanish needed labor to extract all that silver, so they enslaved the local population. They brought African slaves across the Atlantic. They created a system of forced labor called the mita that conscripted indigenous men for months at a time in the mines. The conditions were unspeakable. Miners worked in tunnels thousands of feet underground, in thin air at 13,000 feet altitude. They inhaled mercury vapor used in the extraction process. They developed silicosis from the dust. They died of pneumonia, poisoning, and cave-ins. Estimates of the death toll vary. Some historians say 4 million, some say 8 million. The true number will never be known. What is known is that the silver that built Spanish cathedrals and funded Spanish armies was paid for in indigenous blood. Every coin carried an invisible cost, and still, it wasn't enough to save the empire. By the early 1600s, the signs of collapse were everywhere. The silver shipments were declining. The easy ore had been extracted. The mines were deeper, more dangerous, less productive. But the debts remained. The wars continued. The empire kept spending as if the treasure would never end. Philip III declared bankruptcy in 1607. Philip IV declared bankruptcy in 1627, and again in 1647, and again in 1652, and again in 1662. 9 bankruptcies in 110 years. An average of 1 every 12 years. Each bankruptcy destroyed more trust. Each bankruptcy made future borrowing more expensive. Each bankruptcy pushed the empire closer to the edge. And here's the final irony. Spain had created its own replacement. The Dutch Revolt, funded in large part by Spanish treasure, produced a new kind of economy. The Dutch Republic didn't have silver mines. It had banks. It had joint stock companies. It had sophisticated financial instruments that Spain never developed. By the mid-1600s, Dutch and English ships dominated the seas that Spanish galleons had once ruled. Dutch bankers financed wars that Spanish bankers couldn't. Dutch factories produced goods that Spanish workshops couldn't match. The treasure that was supposed to make Spain invincible had made Spain obsolete. The 1640s broke Spain. It wasn't just the money, it was everything at once. Every crack in the empire split wide open. Catalonia revolted. The Catalans had watched Castile spend their taxes on foreign wars for decades. In 1640, they'd had enough. They actually invited the French king to rule them instead. Portugal declared independence after 60 years of Spanish rule. The Portuguese had their own empire to worry about, and Spain wasn't protecting it. The Dutch were seizing Portuguese colonies in Brazil and the East Indies, while Madrid did nothing. Naples and Sicily erupted in rebellion. The Spanish viceroy had to flee the mob. Italian territories that had been Spanish for generations suddenly looked ready to slip away. The armies that were supposed to crush these revolts needed funding that no longer existed. The 30 Years' War was draining what little treasure remained. The French were pushing into Spanish territory. The Dutch were seizing Spanish colonies in Brazil and the East Indies. An empire built on silver was crumbling because it had nothing else to fall back on. The Count Duke of Olivares, Philip IV's chief minister, tried desperately to reform the system. He proposed spreading the tax burden across all Spanish kingdoms instead of crushing Castile alone. He proposed cutting spending on foreign wars. His reforms failed. He was dismissed in disgrace in 1643, and Spain continued its slide into irrelevance. By the end of the 17th century, the transformation was complete. Spain, which had been the greatest power in Europe just 100 years earlier, was now a second-rate nation. Its military was a shadow. Its economy was in ruins. Its once great industries had vanished. In Cadiz, Spain's main port for American trade, only 12 of 84 commercial houses were actually Spanish. The rest were foreign. Genoese, Dutch, English, German merchants ran Spain's own trade for their own profit. Spanish commentators called it the decline. They blamed corruption, laziness, moral decay. Some blamed the expulsion of the Jews and Muslims a century earlier, which had driven out many of Spain's most skilled merchants and craftsmen. But the deeper cause was simpler. Spain had gotten rich without getting productive, and when the easy money dried up, there was nothing left. The War of the Spanish Succession in 1700 was the final humiliation. The last Habsburg king of Spain, Charles II, died without an heir. His body was as broken as his empire. Generations of inbreeding had left him mentally disabled, physically deformed, and sterile. All of Europe went to war over who would inherit what was left of Spain. The French claimed it. The Austrians claimed it. The English and Dutch, more interested in preventing any one power from dominating, joined the fight. Spain itself barely mattered. The great powers treated the Spanish inheritance like a carcass to be divided among scavengers. The war ended in 1714 with the Treaty of Utrecht. Spain lost its European possessions. The Spanish Netherlands went to Austria. Spanish Italy was carved up. Gibraltar went to Britain, where it remains today. A new dynasty, the Bourbons from France, took the Spanish throne. They would try to rebuild, but the Golden Age was over. The empire that had ruled from the Philippines to Peru, that had threatened to dominate all of Europe, that had more silver than any nation in history, had been reduced to a diminished kingdom clinging to American colonies it could barely control. So what went wrong? The silver didn't disappear. It still exists, scattered across the world. Some of it ended up in China, paying for silk and porcelain. Some of it ended up in India, paying for spices and textiles. Some of it ended up in the treasuries of Spain's enemies, payment for goods that Spain couldn't make itself. The silver flowed through Spain like water through a sieve. It never stuck. It never built anything permanent. Because Spain made a fundamental mistake. It confused money with wealth. Money is just a medium of exchange. It's useful for buying things, but it doesn't by itself create anything. Wealth is productive capacity, factories, farms, skilled workers, efficient systems. The ability to make things that people want. Spain had money but destroyed its wealth. It had treasure but lost its capacity to produce. And when the treasure ran out, it had nothing. The economists have a name for this now. They call it the resource curse. Countries that discover vast natural resources often end up poorer than countries that don't. It sounds impossible. It defies common sense, but the evidence is overwhelming. The easy money discourages investment in other industries. Why build factories when you can dig up treasure? It creates corruption as factions fight over who controls the wealth. Politicians focus on capturing resource revenue instead of building productive economies. It leads to wild swings in income as commodity prices rise and fall. Oil-rich Venezuela went from the wealthiest country in South America to a basket case. Diamond-rich Sierra Leone was torn apart by civil war. Nigeria, Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Gold-rich countries throughout history have fallen into the same trap. The countries that got rich and stayed rich were different. England, they had no silver mines, so they built industries. They invested in education. They created financial systems. They did the hard work that Spain's treasure let them skip. Spain was the first victim of the resource curse, and perhaps the most spectacular. There's another lesson here, a harder one. The silver that built the Spanish Empire was paid for with millions of lives. Indigenous workers in the mines, African slaves shipped across the Atlantic, entire populations destroyed by disease, overwork, and violence. The treasure that seemed like a gift from God was actually stolen from people who had no say in the matter, extracted through systems of brutality that lasted for centuries. Spain didn't just suffer from having too much money, Spain suffered from how that money was obtained. An empire built on exploitation couldn't build the institutions needed for long-term prosperity. A society that valued conquest over production couldn't adapt when conquest was no longer enough. The mountain that ate men eventually ate the empire too. Today, Potosi is one of the poorest cities in Bolivia, one of the poorest cities in South America. The richest hill on earth created one of the poorest places on earth. The mines still operate, but the silver is mostly gone. Workers still descend into the mountain, now mining tin and zinc for a fraction of what silver once brought. They still die young from lung diseases caused by conditions that haven't improved much since colonial times. The average life expectancy of a Potosi miner is around 40 years. They chew coca leaves to suppress hunger and fear. They offer alcohol to a devil statue at the mine entrance, praying for protection. They call it Tio, uncle. The same mountain that ate their ancestors is eating them. The great cathedral still stands, built with silver that flowed through Spanish hands 4 centuries ago. A monument to a fortune that created and destroyed an empire. Cerro Rico, the mountain of silver, has shrunk. 400 years of mining have literally eaten away at it. The peak is lower than it was in 1545. There are fears that it may collapse entirely, honeycombed by tunnels, hollowed out like the empire it funded. Worth a Potosi, they used to say. Worth a fortune. Now it means something different. Spain found more treasure than any nation in history. Enough silver to make every Spanish citizen wealthy. Enough gold to blind the world, and it destroyed them. Not because treasure is bad, but because easy treasure distorts everything it touches. It discourages work. It encourages war. It creates the illusion of strength while hollowing out the substance. The Spanish thought they were blessed. They thought the silver was a reward for spreading their faith, for conquering new lands, for building an empire that stretched around the world. They didn't realize that the greatest blessing a nation can have isn't treasure. It's the need to work, the need to produce, the need to build something that lasts. Spain had unlimited silver. What it needed was something money couldn't buy. The next time someone tells you that finding a fortune would solve all your problems, remember Spain. Remember the treasure fleets loaded with silver. Remember the 9 bankruptcies. Remember the industries that collapsed because nobody needed to work anymore. Remember the mountain that ate men. And remember that the richest empire in the world fell apart because it got exactly what it wished for. Spain didn't fail despite its silver. Spain failed because of it.